India stands today at a paradoxical crossroads. On one hand, it is a country frequently celebrated for historic reductions in absolute poverty, expanding welfare coverage, and rapid economic growth. And on the other, it remains a society marked by deep and persistent inequalities of caste, class, gender, region, and opportunity. This paradox raises a fundamental question, and it's a moral and political one too, which is what exactly should justice demand once these people have enough? One influential answer comes from sufficientarianism, which is a view in distributive justice that claims that what ultimately matters is not how individuals fare relative to one another, but whether everyone enjoys a sufficient level of advantage. On this view, justice requires that nobody falls below a morally significant threshold defined in terms of basic welfare, resources, or capabilities necessary for a decent human life. Once this threshold is met, inequalities above it at best are morally secondary and at worst irrelevant. Sufficientarianism insists that the state's redistributive obligations effectively end once this sufficiency is achieved. At first glance, this appears well suited to India's developmental challenges. In a country where hunger, preventable disease, and illiteracy have historically affected hundreds of millions, prioritizing a sufficiency threshold seems both morally urgent and politically pragmatic. India's post independence welfare architecture, from the public distribution system to employment guarantees, midday meals, and basic health schemes, has largely been animated by precisely this logic. First, ensure survival and then worry about the rest. Yet, this moral clarity begins to unravel once we examine the social realities of contemporary India. For the fact that many Indians now receive calories, cash transfers, or basic services does not mean they enjoy equal standing, equal voice, or equal opportunity. And these inequalities shape who can influence institutions, who can convert resources into real freedoms, and whose lives are treated as socially valuable. Now, the question is then whether sufficiency is truly enough in our public policy in 2025. And this is where egalitarian critics enter the picture. Egalitarians reject the idea that justice loses its force beyond a sufficiency threshold. In societies like India, where historical hierarchies already structure access to land, education, and dignity, post threshold inequality does not remain benign because it compounds after that. Egalitarianism would shift the focus from how much people have to where they stand relative to one another. A society in which everyone is barely above subsistence, but some groups have vastly superior education, influence, and security is not merely unequal, it is simply structurally unjust. Relative advantage translates into political power, social capital, and the ability to be able to shape the rules of the game. Now, in such a context, inequalities are not just outcomes, they are mechanisms. This debate between sufficiency and equality is not just theoretical because this goes to the very core of the Indian constitutional project. The Indian constitution does not stop at guaranteeing minimum subsistence. It has explicitly directed the state to reduce inequalities in income, state, and opportunity and to prevent the concentration of wealth and power. Now, justice in the Indian constitutional imagination is not just satisfied by keeping citizens alive. It requires enabling them to stand as equals in a democratic republic as well. Yet, public discourse has often defaulted to this sufficiency mindset because success is measured in the number of toilets built, bank accounts opened, or ration distributed. Now, while these achievements are truly significant and are morally non negotiable, they risk narrowing our conception of justice to simply delivery. And they encourage a politics of alleviation rather than transformation. A focus on basically lifting people above a line without really interrogating the very structures that determine who constantly hovers near that very line and who soars far above. This narrowing becomes especially troubling when we consider how sufficiency thresholds are defined and operationalized. Because who defines as what is enough? Is it caloric intake? Is it income? Is it number of schooling years? Is it the access to services? These thresholds are not neutral because they are reflecting the political priorities and social assumptions of that particular region and the state. But a threshold set too low will legitimize profound inequality above it. And a threshold that is defined only in material terms may ignore social exclusion, humiliation, or even the lack of political agency for that matter. Now, in a stratified society like India, sufficiency measured narrowly can coexist comfortably with structures of domination as well. The capability approach most prominently associated with Amartya Sen basically offers a lens through which we can interrogate this very problem. Because what Amartya Sen would say was that rather than asking whether people possess certain resources, it asks us whether they have the real freedom to actually achieve valued ways of living. From this perspective, poverty is not merely a lack of income, but a deprivation of capability itself. The inability to be educated, healthy, or secure, or politically active. Capabilities are extremely deeply sensitive to social context itself. The same resource yields very different freedoms for two different people depending on their caste, gender, location, power relations in the particular area, and this exposes the weakness in the argument of sufficientarianism, that even if everybody crosses that minimal threshold, relative inequalities in social power will prevent disadvantaged groups from converting resources into genuine capabilities. Free meals would not ensure dignity if social hierarchies govern who serves whom. In such conditions, ignoring relative inequality would make it morally complicit. And the entire point of doing this video essay is to take India as its case study to argue that justice cannot end at sufficiency. I have 5 hot takes which you guys may find provocative, and it challenges the negative thesis of sufficientarianism, which is the claim that no redistributive concerns remain once everyone has enough. And I'm going to root every argument and take of mine in Indian reality. The aim here is to not dismiss sufficiency as unimportant. Ensuring that every Indian has enough to live is a moral imperative, but it is not the endpoint of justice. It is simply the beginning. A society committed to sufficiency would risk stabilizing inequality rather than overcoming it. A society committed to equality, on the other hand, understood instrumentally and institutionally, would ask harder questions such as who decides, who benefits, and who participates, and also who remains unheard, the subaltern. Now, ultimately, this is a question about the kind of republic India aspires to be. Is justice satisfied when nobody starves, or does justice demand that citizens stand in relations of non-domination, of dignity, and of equal concern before the eyes of the state? Now, the entire point, the answer, which you guys will decide whether or not you agree with me, and it's a conversation to be had, which will determine for us whether welfare is this floor beneath which no one falls, or a ceiling that basically limits our moral ambitions. Now, to understand why the claim that justice requires not only that everyone has enough fails in the Indian context, we need to move beyond abstract theorizing and obviously examine how sufficiency actually operates on the ground. I've drawn these examples from development theory, public policy, and Indian social realities, and they all seem to illustrate a common pattern. That is, material thresholds may be met while injustice continues to persist, and sometimes rather in subtler and more entrenched forms. Now, the first insight that Amartya Sen gives us in Development as Freedom is that he urges us to evaluate justice not by the distribution of resources alone, but also by the distribution of capabilities. That is, the real freedoms that the people have to pursue lives that they value. Now, the distinction is very crucial because in India, where identical resources would translate into radically different outcomes depending on social position. Let's just, for the sake of this argument, imagine 2 children in the same Indian district. They are attending the same government school, they receive the same midday meal, and they are benefiting from the same state-funded education scheme. Now, from a sufficientarian perspective, justice appears to be satisfied because both children are above the threshold of basic educational and nutritional sufficiency. Yet, their lived realities would diverge sharply. One child from a socially dominant caste would be encouraged to speak in class, would be supported at home to even go to school in the first place, and would be treated as a future professional eligible for office or any sorts of jobs for that matter. The other kid is from a Dalit household, sits at the back of the classroom or even outside, faces subtle but persistent discrimination from teachers, from fellow students, and is quietly and structurally discouraged from aspiring. Now, Although these resources in both cases are equal, capabilities are not. The second child's freedom to convert education into opportunity is systematically constrained. Once sufficiency is defined merely in terms of access to goods or services, it would become blind to the social mechanisms that shape how these very goods are experienced. And justice cannot be assessed without attention to relative position, because relative position determines whether sufficiency is meaningful or simply formal or nominal. Now, for the second example, I was studying the Kerala development trajectory. Land reforms were redistributive productive assets to formerly landless tenants, and this was not simply a poverty alleviation measure because it transformed social relations on the whole. Ownership of land meant economic security, meant bargaining power and political voice. Like Ambedkar says, land is identity. It allowed individuals to plan their lives rather than merely cope with them. Later, however, in more recent times, the emphasis has now shifted from redistribution to welfare, what Sudhish would call landfare, where you are using cash transfers, pensions, and subsidies to basically distract from the entire point of redistributive justice. But what these injustices did was they simply alleviated hardship, and they did not restore any productive autonomy at all. A landless household receiving monthly assistance remains dependent on the state and continues to remain vulnerable to policy shifts. Welfare ensures survival. Land reform ensured freedom. The sufficientarian lens would celebrate the former while ignoring the loss of the latter. Now, what appears as progress in absolute terms can represent regression in capability terms. Now, this distinction matters because justice is not merely about preventing deprivation today, but it is also about securing independence and agency tomorrow, or over time for that matter. Now, a society that replaces structural reform with perpetual relief will keep its citizens above subsistence while constantly denying them any means to shape their futures. Another example that I want to take is from urban redevelopment, particularly in informal settlements. Many cities have pursued slum redevelopment policies that guarantee formal housing and tenure to residents. On paper, it's a clear case of sufficiency because families get to move from precarious shelters to concrete apartments with formal legal tenure. But redevelopment would destroy these informal economies in the process because there's a lot of home-based work that goes on, and there's a lot of dense social networks sustained within these livelihoods and these areas. Now, a woman who once ran a tailoring business from the mezzanine of her house will now be prohibited from having any commercial activity from a high-rise apartment with an FSI of 4. Income becomes uncertain for somebody who, say, runs a business of herding animals now that he's shifted to a high-rise apartment. Clearly, housing sufficiency is achieved, but livelihood itself is lost. From a sufficientarian point, the policy has succeeded, but from a capability and egalitarian point, it has now created a new form of vulnerability, one which is less visible, one which is less vocalized, but it is no less real. Now, this example would illustrate why egalitarians themselves insist that justice cannot be reduced to threshold attainment. Without attention to disadvantages and advantages and how they are distributed across social groups, sufficiency can continue to coexist simply with the existence of dispossession itself. Another example I want to take is from public policy measures and how the Indian government measures its success. Now, all these government dashboards that talk about policies frequently highlight their outputs of number of toilets constructed, number of bank accounts opened, number of electricity connections installed. These metrics would align very neatly with sufficientarian reasoning because they answer the question, has everybody crossed the minimum line? Yet, outcomes would tell a completely different story. Toilets go unused due to lack of water or safety. Bank accounts opened but remain dormant. Electricity connections exist but affordability itself is lacking. Now, these schemes often fail to alter underlying hierarchies of power and voice. A woman who has a bank account but no control over its use is as good as having a woman with no account. A household may have sanitation infrastructure, but will still face indignity because of caste-based exclusion. What these examples reveal is that justice is measured simply by checklists and it obscures inequality rather than solving it. Now, when policy success is defined narrowly, your relative deprivation itself hides behind this aggregated process. Let's take the domain of political equality. India is formally a one person, one vote democracy. From a sufficientarian perspective, this appears adequate. Everyone has the basic political right to vote. But political influence is not distributed equally. Wealthier people and corporations can exercise influence through campaign financing, purchasing of electoral bonds, although now that is more transparent, but through media ownership, and access to number of decision makers and people in position of powers. Marginalized citizens, on the other hand, will, although they are formally enfranchised, they clearly lack a comparable voice. Here, relative inequality directly undermines democratic equality. The sufficientarian negative thesis would insist that as long as everyone can vote, disparities in political influence are not just matters of justice. Now, this position itself is very untenable to me. Political equality is not merely about the existence of formal rights. It is also about effective participation. When inequality would allow some voices to dominate institutions, sufficiency itself becomes a very hollow guarantee. Taken together, I am simply getting at a single thesis statement for the video essay, that is that in India, sufficiency without equality is unstable, incomplete, and more often than not, completely misleading. Absolute improvements do matter. They save lives, they reduce suffering. But if they are pursued without attention to relative position, they would leave intact the very structures that reproduce that very injustice across generations. And that's why an egalitarian would reject the negative thesis, because they do not deny the importance of these thresholds. They deny that thresholds exhaust the very demands of justice. Relative inequality determines whether sufficiency empowers or merely pacifies. Justice, therefore, cannot simply end at enough. It must ask harder questions. Who converts these resources into freedoms? Who remains independent? Who speaks? And who is even heard at the end? Now, without addressing these relational dimensions, sufficiency itself would risk becoming not a moral ideal, but a moral ceiling. One that is limiting our ambition for a genuinely just India. As anybody who's watching this as an active citizen, or even as somebody who's trying to be a policy professional at the end of the day. Now, an Indian egalitarian like me would not deny the urgency of poverty alleviation at any cost. What we actually do deny is the sufficiency of alleviation alone. I am rejecting the negative thesis not because inequality is intrinsically sacred, but because inequality in India is instrumentally corrosive. It entrenches caste domination, it distorts democratic institutions, it reproduces intergenerational disadvantages, and it's hollowing out this constitutional promise of equal citizenship. Now, across these 5 hot takes that I give you, I am simply advancing this sustained critique of sufficiency only justice in India. The claim is not that India should pursue perfect equality, but that justice in India cannot be achieved without sustained concern for relative position. And who stands above whom, who commands voice, and who remains structurally vulnerable even after these basic needs are met. Take number 1. In India, equality matters instrumentally, even if it is not intrinsically sacred. Now, let's begin by granting a key concession to sufficientarians that equality need not possess any intrinsic moral worth. One does not need to believe that justice requires identical outcomes, nor that any deviation from equality is morally suspect. This concession is important because it will allow me to sharpen my real disagreement. The Indian egalitarian argument is not metaphysical. It is institutional and political. In India, inequality is not a passive difference in income. It is an active force that shapes access to power, dignity, moral, and democratic influence. Even if an Indian citizen were guaranteed food, electricity, and a bank account and a basic schooling, large inequalities would continue to undermine the core values of the country. Consider political equality. India is a formal one to one vote, one person, one vote democracy, yet the effective value of political participation is radically unequal. Wealthier citizens and corporations exert disproportionate influence through campaign finance, lobbying, media ownership, and informal access to power. Now, the poor may vote, but the rich shape agendas. This is not an accidental feature of Indian democracy, it is structurally linked to inequality itself. When post sufficiency inequalities are allowed to be widely unchecked, economic advantage converts seamlessly into political dominance. Now, the result is a democracy that is formally equal but substantively oligarchic. The sufficientarian negative thesis would tell us that once a Dalit agricultural worker has enough food and basic healthcare, the billionaire industrialist's vastly greater influence would raise no concern of injustice or justice. This is untenable in a polity committed to political equality. This Indian constitutional vision itself has rejected this complacency. The Article 38 of the Indian Constitution has explicitly directed the state to minimize inequalities in income, status, facilities, opportunities. Now, this is not a charitable aspiration. It is a recognition that inequality undermines democracy in the first place. Therefore, even if political equality is not intrinsically valuable, in India it is instrumentally indispensable. Because without curbing larger inequalities, sufficiency would secure survival, but it would not secure citizenship. Number 2. The Indian sufficiency threshold is already a normative and egalitarian choice. Sufficientarianism appears deceptively simple. Define what counts as enough and then direct all state resources to lifting everybody above that line. But in India, the very act of defining the sufficiency is already a normatively loaded and implicitly egalitarian notion. What exactly counts as enough in India? Is it caloric sufficiency under the public distribution system? Is it primary education under the Right to Education Act? Is it employment guarantees under MNREGA? Is it healthcare access under Ayushman Bharat? Or is it something bigger? Is it effective literacy? Is it digital access? Is it political violence and social dignity for that matter? Each answer would reflect a very different moral conception of the Indian citizen. A thin threshold like food, shelter, survival would treat an Indian citizen as a biological being. A thicker threshold, on the other hand, education, health, mobility, autonomy, would treat them as equal members of the democratic community. The Indian state itself has repeatedly opted for the thicker conception, embedding social rights in all its laws and policy. That's why we have so many social policies. Literacy is not a luxury in a modern economy. It is a precondition for agency. Digital access is increasingly becoming a condition of access to welfare itself. A person without a smartphone or an Aadhaar-linked service would be formally entitled to benefits, yet be practically excluded for them. The sufficientarian negative thesis fails on its own terms here. If enough is socially indexed, and in India it necessarily is also, then post-threshold inequalities can push people back before the threshold in real terms itself. Now, sufficiency cannot be secured without ongoing attention to relative standing. Number 3, poverty alleviation without equality would simply reproduce caste and class hierarchies. India's post-independence welfare state has made undeniable progress in poverty alleviation. I'm not saying no. Programs like the PDS, midday meal schemes, and REGA, they've saved lives. They've reduced hunger and they've stabilized incomes. These achievements should not be minimized, and I choose to not do so in any case. But they simply expose a deeper problem. In India, alleviation without equality does not dismantle injustice. It often simply stabilizes it. Take the midday meal scheme, for example. On paper, it is ensuring nutritional sufficiency for millions of children. Yet, empirical investigations have shown that caste hierarchies continue to persist within implementation, like in the example I gave you guys before. Dalit children have reportedly been made to sit separately from each other, bring their own plates, or even receive food from a distance. Now, a meal might fill the stomach, but it does not remove or erase humiliation in any way. NREGA. It has expanded rural employment and it has enhanced women's labor participation. Yet it has not dismantled caste-based occupational segregation in any way, or even the aspect of local elite capture. Wage work exists, but dignity and mobility remains unevenly distributed. These examples are exhibiting this common design of a central flaw in sufficientarian thinking. In India, caste and class hierarchies have converted even universal schemes into differentiated experiences. Without attention to relative status and power, welfare can continue to coexist with domination. From an egalitarian perspective, justice requires not merely that individuals survive, but also that their social position does not condemn them to any sort of permanent inferiority. Relative inequality matters because it shapes how benefits are assessed, how they are interpreted, and how they are lived themselves. That's why the negative thesis is not merely incomplete in India, it is simply misleading. It is inviting the state to declare success while structural injustice quietly goes on to reproduce itself. Okay, take 4. The capability approach reveals why sufficiency alone always fails in India. Let me hit you guys with some empirics. The latest National Family Health Survey found that over 1/3 of Indian children are stunted in growth. More than 1/2 of women of reproductive age in this country are anemic. These are symptoms of long-term capability deficits. Lack of maternal care, inadequate nutrition, and unequal access to education for girls. No cash dole can correct the malnutrition and malnourishment of a generation. Only systematic investment in health and gender equality can. Recent reports show about how 1/3 of the Dalit population in this country has remained mired in multidimensional poverty. Now, this is not because of a lack of resources in the country, but it is simply because of social exclusion and unequal power. Merely providing extra welfare payments to Dalit families will not erase centuries of caste discrimination. Only a transformation of institutions can. It needs to be acknowledged that India has lifted millions out of extreme poverty through growth and alleviation schemes. But as Sen would argue, growth alone is not a guarantee of freedom. If growth is heavily skewed towards the rich, then the poor will continue to see very little to no change in their actual lives. In fact, from 2006 to 2016, our GDP boomed, but the wealth share of the richest 10% has jumped from 47.8% to 57.1%. Yes, extreme poverty fell, but inequality rose. And rising inequality comes with its own costs. It continues to fuel social unrest. It continues to undercut solidarity. When only the privileged can afford quality education or a decent job or healthcare, others feel that they are second-class citizens no matter what food or what money they are given. This sense of relative deprivation can be more corrosive than absolute poverty itself. What then, you guys ask me, is the alternative to this? Justice requires that we restructure this society so that all people have genuine freedom to achieve well-being. This means policies aimed at capability equality. Instead of just asking how many people remain poor, we need to start asking how many people have even a real choice to get out of poverty. We need to measure success not solely by income but by life expectancy, by literacy, by legal rights, by some sort of a metric to measure empowerment. Now, for example, affirmative action in our country, like reservations, can obviously, without a doubt, raise opportunity. But the capability approach would also suggest us to strengthen underlying systems itself. Ensure schooling and teaching is well funded in tribal areas. Protect women's health and legal rights. And break up exploitative tendencies of redundant land distribution systems. Now, in short, combating poverty is necessary, but it is not sufficient for justice. As Ambedkar reminds us, we cannot treat the poor as passive recipients. We need to look at them as citizens who possess agency. The remedy is not just more doles of cash thrown at these people, but it is more equity. It is fairer access to education, fairer representation in politics, fairer wages for work, and more respect in society. We need to learn to see that the poorest in India have rights to capabilities. Only then can we realize the promise of the Indian Constitution. The Indian development story has made this notion of enough as politically seductive. Declining extreme poverty and expanding welfare have encouraged that belief that inequality no longer demands any sense of moral urgency, and this belief is false. In India, inequality is not merely about income gaps, it is about caste power, it is about political voice, it is about dignity, and it is about intergenerational dignity. A society can ensure sufficiency and still continue to remain profoundly unjust. The sufficientarian positive thesis would be affirmed. No Indian should lack food, healthcare, education, or basic security. But the negative thesis needs to be rejected. Justice does not end at enough. For India, justice demands that not only people live, but that they stand as equals. That and nothing less has always remained the promise of the Indian Republic.